In this video, we'll explore creating procedural liquid sound effects with Burble sound synthesizer. Basically, liquid sounds are primarily produced by the release of air bubbles at the surface of a liquid. For example, when you are pouring water into a cup, countless tiny air bubbles form within the liquid. Because air is less dense than water, these bubbles rise toward the surface. As they break free, they create distinct sounds that we associate with liquid movement. To create realistic liquid sounds, first we need to correctly synthesize the sound of air bubbles. The most important physical parameter of a bubble is its radius. The radius of a bubble will determine its frequency, decay rate, and loudness. So we will also need to sample their radius distribution correctly if we want to replicate realistic liquid sounds. All of that is done inside this node. This node can simulate thousands of bubbles per second with extremely low CPU and memory costs. It will also sample their physical parameters based on power law distributions. With this node, you can create realistic liquid sounds for different kinds of interactions. Okay, that's a lot of talking. Let's start playing it with default settings. So the default parameters are set to mimic a continuous stream of water. This node has a lot of input pins, but the important ones are spawn rate, spawn chance, radius distribution, and gain. As usual, its auto stop is used to stop the node automatically when either spawn rate or spawn chance is 0. By default, a random seed will be used every time this node is played. This input pin limits the maximum number of bubbles that can exist at the same time. Because the lifetime of an air bubble is very short, you can hardly ever reach this number. For example, from our observation, even if 10,000 bubbles are created per second, only around 300 bubbles will exist at the same time. Spawn rate is the number of bubbles spawned per second. Because this node is extremely optimized, the spawn rate can go up to half of the sampling rate. Though, realistically, 10,000 is the highest spawn rate we ever need. Similar to other nodes, spawn chance is the chance a new bubble will be spawned on each spawning interval. Radius distribution is the bread and butter of this node. By changing this value, you can simulate different kinds of liquid interactions. As mentioned before, we sample the size of a new bubble from a power law distribution. This parameter is the power part of the distribution equation. If you reduce this, small bubbles will appear more dominant than large ones. And if you increase this, large bubbles will appear more frequently. You want to use small values when the liquid hits a hard surface. For example, for rains, you can set this to 0.52. On the contrary, if the liquid falls into another liquid container, you want to use a high value. If I want to recreate the sound when pouring water into an empty cup, I will first set this to 0.5. Because at the start, the water will hit the cup. Then I slowly increase this to simulate how the cup is filling up. Later I will show you the full pouring graph. Next are radius min and radius max. The minimum allowed radius of a bubble is 0.15 mm. This corresponds to a frequency of 20,000 Hz. Note that changing this will affect the power distribution function. And the maximum allowed radius of a bubble is 150 mm. This corresponds to a frequency of 20 Hz. You rarely have to change these two parameters unless you want to create some special effects. Radius offset is a constant offset added to the sampled radius. It's also meant to be used for some special effects. For liquid sounds, always keep it at 0. This pin allows you to shift the final pitch of all bubbles. Amplitude distribution is similar to radius distribution. We also sample the amplitude from a power law distribution. If you reduce this, the dynamic range will decrease. This input determines how much the radius of a bubble will affect its amplitude. If you reduce this, small bubbles will sound louder. But be careful when using a value lower than 0.95 because it will also make the result less realistic. Amplitude offset is just a constant that will be added with the sampled amplitude. It's also meant to be used for some special effects. Gain is the scale we apply to the amplitude of all bubbles. Gain max is the allowed maximum gain after multiplying the sampled amplitude with the gain above. The chirp ratio will determine how fast the frequency of a burble is changed during its lifetime. If it's positive, the frequency of a bubble will increase over time. And if negative, the frequency of a bubble will decrease over time. The default value is 0.1 because it gives the most realistic results. The decay scale is the scale we apply to the decay rate of a bubble. By default, the decay rate of a big bubble is lower than that of a small bubble. If this is undesirable, you can increase their decay rate using this input. Note that only bubbles with a decay rate lower than this threshold will be changed. For example, if the decay rate is higher than 1000, then it's kept as is. And finally, this pin allows you to use a curve to modify the amplitude of a bubble based on its frequency. The x-axis is the frequency, and the y-axis is the scale applied to the amplitude. Basically, it's like an EQ to further customize your output. Similar to the piano synthesizer, we also create some example curves. Okay, that's quite a lot of parameters. But as I have mentioned, spawn rate, spawn chance, radius distribution, and gain are the important ones for liquid sounds. There is also one node from Unreal that we frequently use together with the synthesizer, which is the diffuser node. Now, this node is usually used for algorithm reverb, which requires a much more complicated structure than just this. However, for liquid sounds, this is enough to enhance the result. We usually mix both of these together. You will feel the effect more if you listen to this on headphones. Without a diffuser, it sounds like the liquid is very close to your head. But with this, it feels much more realistic. Combining these two nodes together will allow you to simulate all kinds of liquid interactions. Let's take a look at this pouring graph. The idea is similar to what I have done earlier. We just add some calculations for the container volume and how quickly it will fill up, and some DSR slopes to control the start and stop. This one is to simulate whether the container is empty or already has some liquid in it. Next is this water stream graph. This graph shows you how to include distance attenuation. At far distances, high frequencies will be absorbed faster than low frequencies. So we increase the radius to amplitude ratio to reduce the gain of high frequency bubbles. We also reduce the spawning chance at far distances. The background stream is just a constant stream of noise. Obviously, it has to be wide, so we use the stereo version of the external force syn. This will give better results than using the mono node and widening it with a delay node. We want to make sure both of these nodes have unique seeds, so we add one here. The model we used here is water pour. We also filter out high frequencies and shift the pitch down at far distances. The waterfall graph is quite similar to the water stream. Let's view this boiling graph. In this graph, you will see that we increase the radius distribution to 1.2. So big bubbles will be more dominant than small ones. To make big bubbles decay faster, the decay scale is also set to 5. You can reduce this if you think it's better. It all depends on whether the lid is closed or not. The Sharpe ratio is set to 0.1 to make the frequency of a bubble reduce over time. This curve here is actually empty. We just expose it in case you want to fine-tune the result. The final graph we will review is this weighting graph. It can be used for deep water movement, like waking in a lake. We randomize radius distribution by using Perlin noise. This is done to simulate the bubble generation at various stages of movement. If you just use a fixed value like this, it sounds either too shallow or too deep. Since we have a lot of big bubbles, we also increase the decay scale, like in the boiling graph. And a DSR slope is used to control the Burble rate on movement start and end. The CPU load is comparable to playing a single wave file, but the memory usage is about 10 times lower. And of course, this is way more flexible and easier to be modified. So we hope you find this new synthesizer useful for creating interactive liquid sound effects. In the next video, I will explain the idea behind these weather graphs, and how to improve them. Bye for now, and I'll see you again soon.